Hello and welcome to the CNSS podcast. My name is Hamisini Hariharan and I'm a non-resident visiting fellow at the Center for National Security Studies. Our guest for today's episode is Bertil Lintner, a Swedish journalist, author and strategic consultant who has been writing about Asia for nearly 4 decades. Bertil was the Far Eastern Economic Review's Burma correspondent and the Asia correspondent for the Swedish daily Svenska Dagbladet. He has written over 10 books on Myanmar and larger Asian geopolitics. His latest book, The Golden Land Ablaze, Coups, Insurgents and the State in Myanmar, was released in October 2024 in London. The copies will hopefully reach the Indian subcontinent soon. Hi, Bertil. Welcome to the CNSS podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been almost 4 years since the military coup in Myanmar. And as you just told me, you have released a new book in London about some of the dynamics behind it. So could you maybe walk us through some of the major developments in the security situation in the last 4 years?
Well, basically, I think most people expected it to be, some demonstrations in urban areas, and they will fizzle out, and the military would be, back consolidating its grip on power. But that did not happen. Instead, what we're seeing now is a widespread insurgency across the nation, across the Burma, and not only in the ethnic minority areas where there's been a civil war for decades, but now also for the first time since the 1970s in central Myanmar. And there's been no insurgency there since the Communist Party was active in those areas in the 1970s. So it is clear that the central authorities in Naypyidaw, the State Administration Council, as they call themselves, has lost a lot of land and a lot of ground, a lot of territory. But on the other hand, there is no unified opposition either. The resistance forces, and there are many, they're very fragmented, and they don't even talk to each other. If you listen to especially American think tankers, they seem to believe that there is a united front, about to overthrow the government, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that is not happening. You got several rival ethnic groups which are taking advantage of the situation. And the territorial claims of those ethnic groups very often overlap. Like in northern Shan state, you got Kachin, Shan, and Palau claiming more or less the same area. You got the ethnic Chinese from Kokang, who have taken over large tracts of land, including the city of Lashio, where they don't normally live. And then even among the majority Burma groups, there's no coordination either. They call themselves People's Defense Forces. Yeah, they might be. But there are different defense forces in different townships. And they also compete for territory, taxation, recruitment, and so on, conscription, and so on. So what we're seeing is actually a fragmentation of the nation, which I think is fairly unprecedented.
I think it's interesting that you're saying that, the United Front is not necessarily united. So could you walk us through some of the strategies of separate groups like the Kachins or the Shan? Because in September 2024, the military did offer a peace deal that was rejected unanimously or not. But yes, maybe we could talk about particular groups and their strategies or thinking about the conflict.
It wasn't really a peace deal. It was more a demand for surrender. And there's no way any of the groups could have accepted it. And it was because the central forces, controlled by the junta, they were feeling the pressure they had to come up with something. And I'm not surprised that nobody was interested in that. But then if you look at the different groups, it's not always clear what they actually want. They always say that the ethnic groups say they want to have a kind of federal system, and similar to what the country had before the first coup in 1962. But it is not clear either how they want a division of power and how they're going to run these new entities, which will emerge from a federal deal, if there is one. Because, there is no single ethnic state in Myanmar. There is only one ethnic group. If you take Shan State, for instance, the largest state, maybe 60% at the most are Shan, And the rest are Kachin and Palau, Kokang Chinese, Wa, Inta, Danu, Pao, and so on. There's a patchwork of different nationalities. In Kachin state in the north, there's a very strong resistance army, the Kachin Independence Army. I don't think more than 30 or 40% of the population is actually ethnically Kachin. The rest are Shan, and there's a very large Shan population in Kachin state. And you got Arakanese, Rakhine, who come there to work. There are tens of thousands of them. You have Burma, who moved in to the state. Then the north of Kachin state, you got Rawang and Liso nationalities, which don't necessarily see themselves as Kachin. And if you look at Rakhine state, you got the Buddhist Rakhine, then you got various Muslim groups, including the Rohingyas, but they're not the only Muslim group. They're also Kaman Muslims. In Mon state, yeah, there are people who consider themselves Mon, but the Mons are probably the most Burmanized of the ethnic minorities in the country. And there's also a lot of Karen living in Mon state. Then you got Karen state, which is a separate state, but most Karen don't live there. Most Karens in the country, they actually live in the Irrawaddy Delta. And then Karenese state, a very small state, it's also a very mixed population of Padang, those long-necked tribe. The women are famous for their long necks. And you got Karenni, and you also got a lot of Shan there as well. There's only one ethnic state which can be said to have one ethnic group, and that's Chin state. But then, on the other hand, they speak many different dialects, which are mutually unintelligible. So when a Tidim Chin and a Phalam Chin meet, they speak Burmese. And they're closely related to the Mizo in India. Right? But the Mizo is the Mizoram, thanks to the power of the Silo chiefs in the past and the church. They got a lingua franca. But still, they speak many different local languages in Mizoram too. But there is one lingua franca in Mizoram. Chin state doesn't have that. There was never that kind of development. So they're still fragmented into various, different local dialects, which are spoken in various parts of the state. So it is an extremely difficult country to run by anyone, really. And to try to create some kind of unity there, or a system that works, is not going to be easy.
Then what kind of federal system would we be even looking for, even theoretically, considering how complex the dynamics are?
Well, I've been at many international conferences when people have been talking about federalism and so on. And I remember especially once I was in Southern California, and an ethnically very diverse part of the United States. One speaker after another went up and said, well, we can have a federal system in Burma, Myanmar, as here in the United States, or Malaysia, an Asian country, multi-ethnic, like Switzerland or like Germany. But then I actually went up and said, wait a minute. The United States is a federation, that's true. But you don't have an Irish state or a Russian state and a Mexican state, Italian state. It's not based on ethnicity. These are geographical areas and many different nationalities represented in each state. Malaysia, yes, is an Asian country. It's multi-ethnic. But you don't have one Malay state and one Chinese state and one Indian state. Those are all the Malay sultanates. It's totally a different thing. Germany, no, it doesn't quite apply because that's a union of the former kingdoms and principalities and so on of pre-united Germany. Switzerland is a very special very special case where you cannot really apply that to Myanmar, to divide the whole country into tiny small cantons everywhere. So I actually said at that time that if you want to look for a model, and I say don't copy it, but study it, you should look at India. Because India has a number of states. They're not defined really by ethnicities, by language. But in effect, it means more or less the same thing. And then you can learn from that experience. Don't copy it, but study it. But then you also have to be prepared for all the problems that India has. How states have been divided up into smaller states and so on. because that is probably the only successful federation of any kind that you should be looking at. Because if you look at other examples of federal unions, you have the former Soviet Union, federal unions based on ethnicity. You have the former Soviet Union, which collapsed and was broken up into many different countries. You got the former Yugoslavia, which is also broke up into many different countries. So if you want to have a federal union based on ethnicity, it is a very dangerous concept. And you find very few examples in the world that has actually worked. And as I said, India, yes, but then be prepared for the problems India has as well.
Yes, I agree. I think I understand why you'd say that the Indian model is very informative, but I think as an Indian quasi-federal model, one of the problems is that I think political institutions want to devolve power only to a certain extent, right? So the states in India will say, oh, we want to devolve power from the center, but then you'll have districts across the country going, what about us? You'll have cities going, what about us? And so that power really needs to be devolved. And I think that is one of the problems that Myanmar would also have to face, considering how the overlap that you said of all of the ethnicities, even in these major areas. I think one of the questions that I had as I was thinking through this is that there are alliances, right? And I know it's not perfect, but I was thinking of the Three Brotherhood Alliance as you were speaking. How do you make sense of alliances between various ethnic groups when it comes to sort of like demands or sort of working together against the junta?
Well, they got a common enemy, but that's about it. The Three Brotherhood Alliance is Palau, Kokang, Chinese, but then Rakhine, Arakanese, but they're actually in Rakhine State. They're not in Northern Shan State. The reason why they're there is because the Arakan army was first raised by the KA, the Kachin Independence Army, because there were many workers from Rakhine State, guest workers, working especially in the jade mines at Bakan. And it was at a time when the KA were under severe, under attack, under pressure from the Myanmar army. And the KA at that time wanted to open a second front in order to pull troops away from Kachin State. So therefore they set up the AA, which was set up in Kachin State. But then they spread to Northern Shan State, where they allied themselves with Kokang, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, MNDAA. And only then did they go to open a front in Rakhine State. And there they have been amazingly successful. They've taken over most of the state. And you find a similar development with the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, which is Palau, but they're using the word Ta'ang instead. There's also a new rebel army, which was also set up by the KIA and trained by them, and then they went into Northern Shan State. And the reason I think why those two armies have been so successful is because they are new, the leadership is young and dynamic. They're not the old warlords who have been fighting in the hills and the mountains for decades. They got new ideas. I've interviewed leaders of the Arakan Army as well as the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, and I found them very different from other ethnic rebel leaders I met in Myanmar. They were younger, better educated. I know they had a background as government civil servants, as teachers. And the commander of the Arakan Army actually used to be a tour guide in Yangon before he went underground. So the people with a completely different background and a different outlook. But they don't really cooperate very well with other groups. If you take Northern Shan State, for instance, the MNDAA, the Kokang group, one of the members of the Brotherhood Alliance, they run Lashio. And what I'm hearing from Lashio, from friends up there, is that nobody likes them there. They don't think they belong there. And a good friend of ours, who has been running NGOs in Lashio for years, he had his home ransacked and completely destroyed by the MNDAA. They came and smashed it up because they thought he was not loyal to the new authorities. And then you got towns like Sipo and Chakme, where we also have friends, predominantly Shan towns, which are now controlled and patrolled by Palauans. They don't want them there. So as I said, but reflects the complexity of the problem.
What you're saying about the change in leadership, with it being much younger and different from the old warlords in the mountains, is very interesting. Is this something that you've seen across other ethnic groups as well?
No, only in the KIA. They had a very dynamic leader for many years called Gunmo. And he actually used to be a drummer in a Kachin boy band in Mandalay before he went underground. And he is younger and is more dynamic, but even he once told me that, look, I'm 50 years old, and people say that I'm too young. But he went to the United States, which was quite unprecedented. And he was well received there. He went to Capitol Hill and met people from the administration. And most of the Kachins are Baptists, so he went around to the Baptist churches and was more or less a rock star when he arrived there. But when he came back, he had to face the music. The Chinese were not happy about that. And the KA has a relationship with China. It's not as close as the relationship that the Chinese have with the Wa or Kokang or the Palong, for that matter. But they control the border with China. They're dependent on China for a number of things, like petrol, for their cars, for food and medicine, and raw materials for making their own guns. And they do make most of the guns themselves. But the Chinese were not happy with that. So after a while, Gunma was sidelined, and an old warlord, Konun Banla, took over. But he was not particularly dynamic. He was something of the old school. But what I'm hearing now from Kachin friends is that Gunmo is quietly back again in the background, directing the fighting. So there is a similar development there. Among the Karen, I cannot see that at all, unfortunately. Among the Shan, they're not fighting anything. They're just staying in their camps doing nothing, really. And if you take the Restoration Council of Shan State, which is based on the Thai border, they seem to be more interested in real estate deals and business deals with Thai and Myanmar businessmen. They have a big army, but they're not doing any fighting. Then it's the Shan State Army, which is the original Shan Army. They're based in central Shan State, not on the Thai border. But they have a very close relationship with the United Wa State Army, and they've basically been armed and supplied by them. And United Wa State Army, which controls about 20,000 kilometers of territory on the Chinese border, are very closely allied with China. And they actually the bulk of the former Communist Party. They took over the area, and since most of the rank and file, the soldiers in the Communist Party's army were ethnic Wa, they became the United Wa State Army. And they claim they are neutral in this war, but of course they aren't. They are the ones supplying Kokang and the MNDA, the TNLA, and AA, and the SSA with guns. And those guns come from China. And there's no way one can do that without the approval of the Chinese. You have China playing a double game here, supporting both sides. One side indirectly through the Wa, who are neutral, and then they have also very close relations with the junta in Naypyidaw. And this makes China's position rather unique, because China so far has been the only outside power with the capacity, the means, and the motivation to play an important role in Myanmar civil wars. And the motivation, of course, is to protect and develop the China-Myanmar economic corridor down to the Indian Ocean.
No, I'm glad that our conversation actually tilted towards China, because I wanted to come there anyway. On one hand, China is supporting rebel groups through the Wa. On the other hand, they're also setting up a private security firm with the Tatmadaw. So how does that sort of dichotomy work? They were also pressuring the Kachins and some of the other groups in some ways, is what according to my reading, to sort of broker peace is what they're claiming. But I'm trying to understand the larger game that they're playing here. What do you make of it?
Well, the main thing is, of course, that they got this geostrategic interest in Myanmar. They want to open a corridor, economic corridor, from its landlocked southwestern provinces and the Indian Ocean, because that's the only way for those provinces to be able to develop a export-oriented economy and catch up with the coastal provinces. And as you know, there are only 3 countries which have a common border, neighboring countries, which have a common border with China, which also have access to the Indian Ocean. It's Pakistan, and there is, the Karakoram Highway. But it's not insignificant, but it's a very dangerous highway. It's blocked by ice and snow in winter, and it's too far west anyway, far away from any of China's industrial centers. And then you come down to Pakistan, which is politically extremely unstable, in a different way from Myanmar. In Myanmar, the central authorities are very stable. The outlying areas are not. In Pakistan, it's the central government that is not particularly stable and changes all the time. And then the other country, of course, is India. And the Chinese would love to open a route from Tibet down to Calcutta, to use the port of Calcutta. They already built a highway down to Nathula the Pass in Sikkim. But I don't think India was particularly keen on letting the Chinese open the kind of route down to the Indian Ocean. No, so forget about that. That leaves Myanmar. And therefore, Myanmar is of such enormous geostrategic importance to China. And one has to look at that in order to understand China's Myanmar policy. Why are they so involved in what's happening in Myanmar? What kind of interests are they protecting, and how are they doing it? They cannot see that the security situation has deteriorated across the country. And the Myanmar army is not capable of providing security for Chinese investment in Myanmar, and certainly not for the gas and oil pipelines, which go from the coast of the Bay of Bengal up to Yunnan. So then they come up with a solution that private security companies, well, is anything really private in China? The problem is that the Myanmar Constitution, the 2008 Constitution, says that no foreign troops will be allowed to be based and stationed in the country. But the way around that is to protect these private security companies. They can say, oh, it's private. But of course, who are they? They're all former Chinese army anyway. And the joint, no, I don't believe that. How is that going to work? Burma and Chinese working together? What language are they going to speak to each other? What kind of discipline are they going to use? How are they going to carry out their operations? So I think that the Myanmar participation in this security arrangement will be mostly token, nothing more than that. It will be basically Chinese security companies, or more precisely, the Chinese army moving into Myanmar under disguise in a different kind of capacity. And then China is already working outside its own borders when it comes to security. If you take the Mekong River, it forms the border between Myanmar and Laos, right? And then it goes down to Thailand. I went up that river a couple of years ago because I was going up and visit the Wa. And it was the only way to sneak in from that back door, so to speak. And I saw patrol boats on the Mekong River, which had written on the side of them in English, China Police. And this is way south of the Chinese border. So they were patrolling the Mekong River already, several years ago. So they are there, but they're there in different strange capacities, security firms or police or whatever. But it is an interesting development. And the question is, what are these security companies going to do, private? Yeah, I think the main thing will be to protect the gas and oil pipelines, and the special economic zone is building at Chokpyu on the Bay of Bengal. And then part of Rakhine State is still controlled by the central government in Naypyidaw. Probably the only part of the state that is still firmly under their control.
This is interesting because you'd mentioned Pakistan, but China also has private security firms in Balochistan guarding some of the projects there, particularly because it's come under attack from Baloch groups. Do you see sort of a similar dynamic with the projects in Chafq?
Absolutely. But in Pakistan, I think they can say that they are Chinese security companies, if I'm not mistaken. But when they can say that in Burma, they have to say it's a joint venture. They're working together. Of course, they're not. How can they? How would that work?
The other thing that I've been thinking about is Min Aung Hlaing went to China last month in November. And so, what is sort of the relationship between the junta and China? I'm sure the junta is very unhappy with the way the Chinese also armed several rebel groups. So, what do the conversations between them look like?
Well, China would deal with any government that's in power in Ecuador. Doesn't matter. Look, even when Aung San Suu Kyi was the state councillor, we invited her to Beijing, they rolled out the red carpet, and she was actually the one who had Myanmar attached and recognized under the Belt and Road Initiative, not the military government, the military-controlled government. So they will deal with anyone who is in power. I think they would prefer a military government because it's more authoritarian, more like themselves. But if there's another government in power in Ecuador, they will deal with them too. Because the main China's interest in Myanmar are long-term. That's to control and manipulate the situation inside the country. And for that reason, I don't think China is interested in peace either. Because let's say, for argument's sake, tomorrow everybody sits down, they say, oh, the war is over, let's be democratic, have elections, they have a federal system which everybody will be happy with. China will be the first country to lose. They will lose leverage inside the country. They will not be able to manipulate the situation. They will not be able to play off one group against the other. China doesn't want chaos either, and now there is chaos, because that means that trade is disrupted, and if the chaos gets worse, there will be a flood of refugees into China, and they don't want that. But a certain degree or a certain amount of instability, which they can manage and control, I think that is in China's interest. They don't want to see a democratic federal Burma, no way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting observation. If it doesn't want peace and it doesn't want war, they want a certain level of instability that China can manage. And this sort of brings me to some of the border areas that China shares with Myanmar. And China says that a lot of the ports on the Myanmar-China border are closed. But one of the things that you had mentioned earlier is the way that they funnel arms and supplies through the United Wa State Army. So how does that border really work there?
Well, it's closed for, let's say, ordinary traders. But when it comes to the PLA, the Chinese army, I mean, they don't have to lead to that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the ones also have enough stockpiles to support or supply the other groups with whatever they need. I haven't heard of any more recent arms supplies from China. But even what they have now, what they had in their arms depots for years, there's no way they can send that to other groups, or pass it on to other groups, without the Chinese giving their tacit approval. An example of that is when the KIA headquarters at Lhasa was under attack. I was there at the time, 2013. The major problem was aircraft, helicopter gunships and jet fighters. And the Kachins wanted to buy surface-to-air missiles, manpads, from the WA. The WA agreed. The Chinese said no. They didn't get any.
But that's interesting. I understand that a lot of what China does is, everything that China does is in its own national interests. But are there reasons why in certain situations they prefer to provide arms and ammunition, and in some cases they pull back?
Well, they also made an arms supplier to the Myanmar military, as you know. But here's another interesting dimension to the problem. The Myanmar military is fierce and nationalistic, very protective of what they see as their nation, right? And in the late 80s, throughout the 1990s, they became so dependent on China for almost everything, including the supply of military equipment, that they actually felt that the sovereignty of the country, the independence of the country was in danger. And this, I'm not making it up. I have copies of classified internal documents from the Myanmar military stating exactly that. We are becoming a colony of China. We have to do something about it. And that is when they started dealing with Russia. And Russia then became a major arms supplier as well. That's hence the helicopter gunships, which are Russian, big jet fighters, tanks, and armored personnel carriers, which were actually Russian but acquired through arms dealers in Ukraine at the time. But that's, of course, not possible anymore. And Russia, of course, was very pleased to have this relationship with Myanmar. Russia had, Soviet Union used to be a world power. They had a very close relationship with Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, and even India. But they lost that. And they became, second, third class world power. And suddenly there's Myanmar emerging there. It's their main ally, really, in Southeast Asia. And over the years, Myanmar had been sending thousands of cadets to Russia for training, military schools and academies. And there's even now a Burmese temple in Moscow. There are Burmese restaurants. You need that. They don't like Russian food. So the relationship with Russia is very close. But on the other hand, if the Chinese and the Myanmar don't get on or are different, what about the Russians and the Myanmar? They are very, very different culturally, socially, the way they behave and everything. So it's a marriage of convenience, but it's a way in which the Myanmar military is trying to counterbalance its heavy dependence on China. So the relationship between China and Myanmar is not that straightforward as many people think. It's a very troubled relationship. And if you talk to Myanmar Burma officers, and I know some, especially older ones, they still remember how China used to support the Communist Party of Burma with arms and ammunition at the time when China was exporting revolution instead of washing machines and motorcycles. And it's one of these army officers said, it's a scar in our heart. Our boys were killed with Chinese bullets, and we haven't forgotten that.
With the war in Russia and also sanctions since the coup in Myanmar, do you see China assuming its unique position again?
Yeah, they are, absolutely. They took full advantage of the war in Ukraine to reestablish all kind of trade links and other links with Myanmar. So from that point of view, the war in Ukraine was actually, they worked to China's advantage. They were not unhappy about it in that tiny perspective, seen a tiny perspective. So the military is in a similar situation. They cannot depend on Russia in the same way as they did before. They have to turn to China as well. And that's why China is coming in now, trying to act as a peacemaker. And they are probably the only country, or the only other country that can do that. They can talk to both sides, and both sides would have to listen.
That's something that they're trying to do on the global stage as well, project themselves as a mediator in international crises. But something that I think also is interesting to me is what you'd said earlier about the elections. China is pushing for the elections in Myanmar next year. What do you make of that?
Well, they're pushing for elections in Myanmar, but they will never allow elections in China, of course. So there's a difference if we're talking about multi-party elections. But I think what they want to restore some degree of stability in the country, some semblance of stability. And then the country has to be ruled by, some kind of government which is not just a military junta. So it is in China's interest to get the kind of semblance of stability. Because then the other countries in the region would also probably say, okay, it's better than nothing. Then let's deal with these guys. ASEAN will be the first to jump on the bandwagon because Myanmar is a member of ASEAN and Myanmar is a huge embarrassment to ASEAN. And there's nothing ASEAN can do about it. And because as you know, ASEAN has two cardinal principles. One is non-interference and then the other is consensus. which means you can't do anything. But they would like to see, as I said, some semblance of stability return to Myanmar. And the elections could possibly achieve that image internationally, not in the country, because where are they going to carry out this election? An election, people have been appointed, to prepare for the elections. Many of them have already been assassinated by the resistance. But they are quite brutal as well when it comes to killing suspected informants and people working for the junta. They have been assassinated without any, due process at all. Lots of them. Dalangs, as we call them, which means, their case of the junta.
So how do you see the elections playing out next year? Do you think it'll be a situation like in Afghanistan where elections happened, I think, last year? Or, how do you see it playing out?
The problem is that the military has never been particularly successful when it comes to holding elections in the past. It's not been to their advantage. The first election in 1990, then the scored a landslide victory, but then they said, no, we did not elect a parliament, it's Constituent Assembly. Yeah, sure. But then 100 of about six of those have been elected, about 400, a quarter, had to sit together with 600 people who were appointed by the military and draft a new constitution, which lasted about 10 years or more. And then came the next election, 2010, which NLD, the National League of Democracy, boycotted. And it was a fraudulent election, everybody knows that. But on the other hand, it gave also the country semblance of a return to normalcy. And then President Thein Sein took over, and he was a former secretary in the previous junta, the military general. And everybody saw him as a kind of, Burmese Gorbachev or something, which he wasn't. No way. He was just carrying out what the military had decided to do. And one of the reasons why Myanmar did that at the time was this heavy dependence on China. Then they realized that they had to open up to the outside world and improve relations with the West. But in order to do that, they had to make certain concessions. And that was done. So it was not that, they suddenly woke up one morning with a democratic awakening experience. There was a strategic thinking behind that as well. But then it came the 2015 elections. And they probably thought, I think the military at that time thought that their party, the USDP, Union Solidarity Development Party, had become so popular because of they opened up the country. Overnight, Myanmar turned from being the international pariah to being the darling of the Western world. I mean, everybody went there. Obama went there. The King of Norway went there. So, but there was a miscalculation. The NLD won a landslide victory, and the same thing in 2020. And in 2020, they thought probably that the NLD government hasn't performed very well, and especially in urban areas, among the middle class, people were unhappy with Aung San Suu Kyi. She didn't live up to their expectations. In the ethnic minority areas, he had very little support, but the party won anyway. And the reason for this, if you look at these elections in 1990, forget about 2010, 2015 and 2020, I don't think one should see them as normal, so to speak, elections where people vote for different parties and different policies. They were referendums where the NLD stood for people's desire for change. And the military-supported parties in 1990, it was the National Unity Party. In 2015 and 2020, it was the USDP. They stood for the old order. And there was a yes or no vote, really, a referendum. But there was also a third element to those elections, the ethnic issue. So that's why the ethnic parties did extremely well, especially the Shan Nationalities League for Democracy. They were loosely allied with the NLD, but they still had their own demands and agenda that they wanted to preserve the ethnic rights for their various nationalities. So when you look at the next election, can there also be the kind of referendum? Well, if the Myanmar military has learned anything from past experiences, they won't let it happen. They probably don't want to let the NLD take part in the election or whatever they will do. This time they will make sure that the USDP wins. But can they do that? I think that's the intention. But can they succeed? Can they do that? I don't think so.
Why not? What would be stopping them, considering that they've monopolized most power in the country?
The voters, they wouldn't vote for a military party. And then they can either ignore the election, come up with some excuse as they did in 1990, or they can also, for the election, they can have a fraudulent election, which they, of course, control. So, they use the P1. I mean, look at Venezuela, very similar kind of a development. So that's also possible.
How does the NLD or the unity government fit under this? What is the Aung San Suu Kyi up to? What is happening on that front? Are they contesting in elections next year? Are they preparing?
No, they are not. Because they can't do anything, really. And Aung San Suu Kyi is in solitary confinement in a prison in Ecuador. Nobody has heard anything from her or about her for months. She'll be 80 next year. And many people fear that she will actually die in prison. The last person to be in touch with her in any way was her younger son, Kim, who managed to send a kind of package to her with things that he thought she needed while she was in prison. And she got a greeting back as well. But that's months ago. Since then, nothing. So we don't know at all what has happened to her. That she will be released. I would be astonished if that happened. I would be very surprised. But then Burma, again, is full of surprises, as we know. But she's getting really old now. She's 80 and she's very unwell. Her health is deteriorating quite rapidly, from what I understand. The NLD has ceased to function as a political party. They just can't do anything anymore. So we have to wait and see what they come up, when the military comes up, which kind of rabbit they pull out of the hat for the election next year. There will be something, but we don't know that yet.
And, considering all of the complexities that we've talked about in the last 40-odd minutes, how do you actually see realistic sort of pathways to dialogue? Are there ways in which internal or external factors could actually trigger a breakthrough, or is that pipe dream?
I don't think that's going to happen. And the Burmese tradition has also always been very confrontational. But I live in Thailand, where compromises is an art. They avoid conflicts and they compromise about everything. They be too much, I think, but they do. Myanmar is just the opposite. It's confrontation. It's a completely different political culture. And if you look at peace talks in the past, I actually wrote a report about it last year. Because everyone was talking about dialogues, peace, this and that and the other. Lots of foreign organizations came there, expert advice. We have negotiated peace in Burkina Faso before. We can do it here as well. I mean, it was a joke. So I got so annoyed with this. So I actually wrote a report where I went through the country, Myanmar's failed peace talks, failed peace process in the past, starting from 1948, the year the country became independent. Then Takin Kodamang, a very well-known personality, tried to negotiate peace, failed. In the 50s, there were more peace talks, failed. 1963, there was what they call a peace party in Yangon, where all the different groups, ethnic and political, came there for talks, failed. In the 1970s, there were several attempts to talk to different groups, failed. 1980, there was a general amnesty. A lot of political prisoners were released. Talks were held with the KIA and the CPB, the Kachin and the Communist Party, failed. And then in the late 80s, the then military strongman, General Kinyot, entered into a number of ceasefire agreements with about 10 different ethnic armies. Everybody was saying, oh, fantastic, there are ceasefire agreements. But the problem was that the only thing those ceasefire agreements achieved was that they froze the problem. They didn't solve them. So the problem became dormant for a while. And when, after some time, all those problems resurfaced again with a vengeance. And that's why we're seeing this widespread civil war today. And if I were to look at peace efforts in Myanmar, one has to look at past experiences and why all these talks failed. And here I'm not blaming only the military, because the military always wanted everyone to surrender. And then if they surrendered, they could either become businessmen or they become a local militia, but no political concessions. That's been the military's line from the very beginning, from the late 1940s until now. On the other hand, the resistance armies have not, in the past, their demands were not particularly realistic either. Some of them, like the Kachins in the beginning, wanted total independence from Myanmar. They don't demand that anymore, but that's what they said in 1963, for instance. The Communist Party came up with all sorts of total unrealistic demands. And I can't see any way forward here unless people sit down and thoroughly go through what happened in the past and why any attempts to establish peace there has failed. I mean, there's no other country in the world where there's been a civil war for 70 years and with no solution in sight.
I think that this brings us back to what we discussed at the beginning of the podcast. It's been 4 years since the coup happened. There is no end in sight. Peace talks in the past have failed. And so where do we go from here?
Well, I don't think there's much we can do about it, really. But sadly, I think we will see many more years of misery. And the people have to suffer, of course, the ordinary civilians who are caught in the crossfire. There will be more suffering in the country. There will be more refugees coming to neighboring countries like Thailand, like India. And it's just going to get worse. And actually, yesterday I met a person from Myanmar who has contacts with the military. And he said that the military is fully aware, they're not stupid, they're fully aware how serious the situation is. But they think if they hold out and if they continue the way they have been doing so far, they will be able to re-establish control over the country, even if it may take 30 years. That's what they said. That means 100 years of war. But
yeah, and it's also, it forces you to think about the cost.
Yes.
The human cost, the cost of lives and livelihoods and people.
Yeah. I mean, Thailand now, for instance, is full of refugees from Myanmar. And many of them are fleeing the war, especially ethnic minorities. Chiang Mai, where I live, there are thousands. And many are journalists, intellectuals who can no longer function inside the country. And then came this new conscription law, where they introduced the national service because the manpower was a problem there with the manpower for the army. And I was down in Bangkok a couple of weeks ago, and I went to Chatuchak Weekend Market to buy things, a few things. It's a huge market there, we can buy everything, anything. And I went to sit down there to the cafe to have a drink, and I tried to order something in Thai, and nobody there spoke Thai. They were all from Burma. So I asked them, did you come here? And I asked the waiter. They said, I came here a few months ago. I said, why? I know this conscription thing. I didn't want to go to the army. So this is a small example of a very big problem, really. So you got this, and I don't know exactly how many refugees there are in India right now, but it's becoming a serious problem in Manipur. And I was in Manipur in March this year, and there the confrontation or the problems are building up tremendously between various ethnic groups, and about also many who have come from across the border. Mizoram has also a lot of refugees, but because many of them are Chin, so they're sort of related to the Mizo, you don't see exactly the same kind of problem there. But it's still something that we're talking about tens of thousands of people here. And that is a security problem by any stretch of the imagination. So even for India.
Yeah, since we're coming to India, of course, refugees from Myanmar have found their way here for decades now. With this current stage of the conflict, 4 years since the current coup, are there things that the Indian government can do, should do?
Well, I think I'm, of course, an outsider. I'm not an advisor to the Indian government, right? But I think there's many things. I think India should be paying much more attention to its eastern border. Me, looking at it from an outsider, India's security focus, has always been on its western border with Pakistan, Kashmir. Yes, to see the situation there. Two nuclear powers countries confronting each other, insurgencies in Kashmir. But there's no dynamics there. Nothing is going to change. It's going to be like that forever, right? More or less. But if you look at the eastern border, why is the eastern border so important? And it should be so important to India. Well, first of all, if you look at the Act East policy, first there was it Look East? No, it's Act East. Myanmar is between India and the fairly prosperous economies of Southeast Asia. And there was talks about building highways and railways and whatnot through Myanmar to connect India with first Thailand and later on Malaysia and Singapore or whatever. So therefore, India has an interest in seeing some kind of solution to the internal conflicts in Myanmar. The other reason is cross-border insurgencies. We know that Manipuri, Naga, and Assamese rebels have camps up in northwestern Myanmar, in Sagaing region, from where they can launch cross-border raids into India, and they do that occasionally. And then they withdraw to the Myanmar side, where the Indian army can't reach them. So the cross-border insurgency is another reason. The third reason why I think the eastern border should be India's most important border, really, when it comes to security, is the China factor. Does India want to have another Chinese ally on its eastern flank? I don't think so. It's enough for Pakistan there, and look at what happened in Nepal and Bangladesh. So obviously, India has definitely also geopolitical interest in some kind of order being established in Myanmar. And the fourth bit is not that important anymore, but it was in the past. I mean, India's rapidly expanding economy needs energy. And India tried, before all these sort of things blew up, to buy gas and oil, gas mainly from Myanmar. There also talks at one stage of building a hydroelectric power station in the Chinmen River, and then would then supply India with electricity. That was shelved because there was too much opposition to it. So India actually listened to those critical voices and thought that, no, it's not a good idea. China has not done that. They are still trying to push ahead with this enormous mega dam up in Kachin State at a place called Mitso. And that has caused a lot of anti-Chinese sentiments in the country, a lot. And I think India didn't want to have the same kind of reaction if they sort of went in and built a hydroelectric power station in the Chinmen River. But if you look at those four factors, I would argue that the eastern border is India's most important border. And there is some dynamic. There's something can happen there. Something can change. It's not like the stalemate on the western border. But unfortunately, India doesn't seem to be that focused on events in the East.
Yeah, I think you've made a very good case for why India should be concerned about the East. And I do think that there is some shift happening, particularly because of what's happening on the border with China. So hopefully we'll see more attention being given to the eastern border. And I think that's a good note for us to end on, sobering as it is. Thank you so much for your time, Bertil, and for explaining all of these extremely complex situations so lucidly for us.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the situation. Nothing I can do about it. When they write about it, and it's not very encouraging, to be frank.
No, but we can try to get more awareness about it and get more people talking about it, and hopefully that helps.
Really.
All right, I think we can stop the recording here. Thank you, but it was honestly so lovely chatting with you, even if it is extremely sobering, the state of events. But yeah, this has been a really good chat.
I hope so. It was fun too. Fun, perhaps the right word.
Yeah, and I will just link it to some of your books on Myanmar and the new one, even if it is just released in London right now. And I'll send you a link to it as soon as it's released.
Please, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
Likewise.
The CNSS podcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies. The Center for National Security Studies was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non-traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established by an MOU between MS Ramaiah University of Applied Sciences and the Army Training Command. You can find out more about the work at cnss.msruas.ac.in.